Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us for today's EWG Facebook Live discussion on a recent report that nearly $16 million have gone into the pockets of members of Congress and their families from the federal farm subsidy programs. My name is Jared Hayes, policy analyst here at EWG. I'm excited to be joined today by Caroline Kitchens, Director of Government Affairs at the R Street Institute, and Don Carr, a senior advisor here at EWG who works on all things agriculture. Shortly, we'll hear from each of our panelists, and then we want to hear from you. If you have any questions on today's topic throughout the discussion, please feel free to enter them into the comments section on this Facebook Live page, and we will get to as many as we can towards the end of today's discussion. With that, we'll kick things off. So it's hard to be surprised about anything these days, but this one found a way for us. Recently, EWG released our latest round of federal farm subsidy data that we received from the US Department of Agriculture. In our analysis of this data, we discovered that 33 current members of Congress have raked in nearly $16 million in federal farm subsidies. 16 million. Over $1 million of that alone came from the Market Facilitation Program, or MFP. These bailout payments were meant to help struggling farmers weather the impacts of the Trump administration's ongoing trade war with China. EWG obtained this subsidy data through Freedom of Information Act requests from the USDA. We then compared those results to members of Congress's publicly available financial disclosure forms, which can be found right on the House and Senate websites. These forms list all the financial holdings of each member, the names of their businesses, including farms that they held ownership interests in. Now, while some of these members only received a few $100s over the years, several others have taken in millions from these programs. The largest recipient on this list was Representative Doug Lamalfa of California, whose farm took in nearly $5.5 million in subsidies, including $54,000 in bailout payments. And that isn't even the largest bailout payment made to a member of Congress. And what was even more shocking to find was that Representative Lamalfa, along with 13 other current members, sit on either the House or the Senate Agriculture Committees. Their positions on these committees mean that these members are essentially helping to write their own paychecks by crafting the very programs into the Farm Bill. And Don and Caroline, who are with us today, can likely speak on this in more detail, but do these members really need these taxpayer subsidies on top of their own $174,000 paychecks each year? And what's missing from this report is the unknown amount that these and potentially many other members of Congress receive in federal crop insurance subsidies. For crop insurance, every year the government hands out billions of dollars to subsidize insurance for farms. This is meant to help struggling farmers pay what could be high rates for insurance on their crops. But even the largest and most affluent farm operations are receiving these benefits. And we have no way of knowing how much each individual operation gets from these programs. And that's because of USDA rules. So the 16 million that we know of that members of Congress have received could be much higher if we knew the full extent of these payments. Clearly, there's a problem here. It shouldn't be up to groups like EWG to be figuring out how much our elected officials are making off of these programs that they have control over. And this is happening all the while we're seeing record numbers of farm bankruptcies across the country. These farms that are going bankrupt are primarily small family farms, some that have been run for generations. Farms that are supposed to be the true beneficiaries of these support programs. But sadly, these ever-expanding subsidy programs are consistently going to the largest operations. Those operations that then buy up the small bankrupt farms. And some of these large operations are known to take in millions of dollars in subsidies every single year. And they do this by manipulating the system that was set up in part by the very lawmakers who are also benefiting from this system. A sad and very recent example of this lopsidedness were the Trump administration's trade war bailout payments. The Office of Management and Budget, or the government spending oversight body, recently released a report looking at how these payments were made and who they went to. It turned out that the vast majority of the payments went to just a handful of operations, as the government continues to pick winners and losers in the agriculture field. And to put some numbers to this for those who are curious, for the bailout payments, the top 1% of recipients received over $500,000 each. Meanwhile, the bottom 80% of recipients each received around $9,000. Something's wrong here. This system that clearly doesn't work like it should. And we need to be pushing for real policy changes so that things like members of Congress being able to take in millions of dollars from the programs that they write doesn't continue. And now I've probably gone a little over my time. So here I will hand it off to Caroline Kitchens of R Street Institute, who has worked very closely on these issues and who has experience working with Capitol Hill on finding ways towards reform. Caroline?
Yeah, thank you, Jared. Thanks so much for having me. And I really want to thank EWG for all of the incredible work you do digging into farm subsidies. It's really not easy to find out who's getting subsidies, and that's because the people who are crafting farm bills don't want you to know. And the information uncovered in the report, is exactly why they don't want you to know. So I really can't emphasize enough how important it is to have groups like EWG who are serving this crucial government watchdog role and holding policymakers accountable. So as Jared mentioned, I work at R Street. R Street is a free market, right of center think tank. We often focus on protecting taxpayers, reining in government abuse and overreach, and the so-called farm safety net is just a shining example of waste and corporate welfare. I mean, every year, all of us who pay taxes are subsidizing the incomes of millionaires and billionaires who may not even live or work on a farm, but are exploiting the farm support system. It's simply indefensible. I think most of us can agree that there's a place for the government to provide a true safety net and help farms that are struggling to stay afloat. But there's simply no reason why taxpayers should be giving literally millions of dollars to wealthy agribusinesses and politicians who, by the way, as Jared mentioned, already receive a salary that is paid for by Americans. And I think at a time when Americans around the country are just suffering, struggling from the fallout of the pandemic, so for these reasons, groups on the right like my own, and even I guess groups farther to the right like the Heritage Foundation, have joined with our friends in the environmental community and on the left in opposing the status quo farm bill. So far in 2020, government payments have accounted for 40% of total farm income in the US. Just think about that. I mean, nearly half of farm income in the US is paid for by taxpayers, by hardworking Americans. There is simply no other sector of the economy where this is the case, and it's not a sustainable fiscal trajectory. If we want to put it on the right path, I think the first step is putting a scope around it, targeting it towards those in need, and addressing some of these cases of abuse. So I know that Jared and Don are going to dig into a lot of the findings of the report. I just want to quickly highlight a few solutions that I think would help address some of these challenges. Step one, end farm subsidies for non-farmers. It sounds like common sense, but there are lots of non-farmers who receive farm subsidies, including perhaps some of these lawmakers. Lawmakers should place a strict payment limit on subsidies, and they should close the loophole that allows unlimited farm managers to be added for the purpose of collecting subsidies. Current policy allows farmers who don't even live or work on a farm to collect up to $125,000 in subsidies a year. Their spouse is eligible for another $125,000. And since the last farm bill, even distant family members like cousins, nieces, and nephews are also eligible. So it's easy to see how this can be exploited. And the loophole should be closed so that subsidies are not going to wealthy people living in Manhattan or beach houses in Florida, as EWG has found before. Second, as Jared has mentioned, the analysis doesn't even cover the full scope of what these members received, since crop insurance subsidies are not transparent and not disclosed to the public. And in many cases, taxpayers are actually subsidizing farmers twice for the same loss, because they might receive traditional commodity subsidy payments as well as payments through federally subsidized crop insurance. So lawmakers should end double dipping or duplication in farm support programs. And they should also make crop insurance payments transparent so that we can see where our taxpayer dollars are going. Finally, we should impose a means test on crop insurance. Traditional farm subsidies do have a means test, albeit not a very strict, meaningful one. Farmers with an income above $700,000 or 1.4 million if you farm with your spouse are not eligible, but crop insurance has no means test. So that means even billionaires can receive subsidized crop insurance, and the subsidies are virtually unlimited. I think when you think about it, every other form of government welfare requires recipients to meet an income threshold and show that they're truly in need, and the farm support system should be no different. There are a lot of other reforms that have been proposed. These are just a few, but there are many common sense, bipartisan, extremely modest reforms, but every time a farm bill comes around, they're blocked by the ag committees, and people in power prevent them from even being considered. And I think for anyone who has worked on the farm bill, when you see this data from this report, it just really underscores why it is so difficult to get even the tiniest, most incremental reforms. I mean, why would members of House and Senate Ag support stricter means testing or payment limits when they and their families are literally receiving these payments? I really can't imagine any other sector of the economy where those who are crafting policy are literally the ones benefiting from it monetarily, and the voices of just everyone else are completely excluded. This is a national scandal. I want to thank EWG again for bringing this to light. In the interest of time, I'll stop here, but happy to answer any questions and turn it over back to Jared.
Thanks for that, Caroline. For those of you who just joining us, this is a EWG conversation about a recent report on the 33 members of Congress who have received nearly $16 million in federal farm subsidies. If you have any questions for our speakers today, go ahead and enter them into the comment section on this Facebook Live page, and we will try to answer as many as we can at the end of the discussion. Now I'd like to turn it over to Don Carr, Senior Advisor here at EWG. Take it away, Don.
Thanks, Jared. And Caroline, you had made some great points there. I'd like to echo everything you said. You're totally dead on. And I'd like to add to that this is actually a bipartisan problem. Lawmakers from both parties are getting the subsidies, and lawmakers from both parties are constructing these policies to keep the money flowing back into their pockets. Especially with crop insurance. Caroline was talking about crop insurance, how opaque it is, not transparent. There's a funny story, not funny, a terrible story actually. In 2014, an amendment was actually put in on crop insurance just to make the recipients known that were members of Congress. You would think that would be some type of good governance, that at least we'd know which members of Congress got crop insurance subsidies. We don't need to know which billionaires get them, just members of Congress. That was roundly defeated. And crop insurance has, as Caroline tapped on, the same problems as traditional subsidies. They go to the biggest, largest farms, wealthy landowners who might not need these subsidies. Folks living in cities, cousins, people who might call into a conference call twice a year in order to be eligible for these subsidies. These payments should really go to folks with dirt under their fingernails, whose butts are on tractor seats, who are actually out toiling in the fields, and to the smaller, medium-sized, struggling family farms, not mega farms and not wealthy landowners. Now, the other point I want to make is there's policy differences here in terms of how USDA looks at serving all the people with the money that we've paid in taxes. Subsidies go out all the time. We've shown the problems with that. There's other programs at USDA like SNAP or food stamps that try and help hungry Americans put food on their table when they can't do that. These programs are stringently means tested, and the benefits are meager compared to the farm subsidy payments. So I'd like to look at a couple of our folks that Jared, in his great report on members of Congress that receive farm subsidies, what they got and what the policies they've supported. Jared touched on Doug Lamalfa, from a congressman from California, and his big subsidy payments. In 2013, Lamalfa supported a cut of $20 billion to the food stamp program. Vicky Hartzler. I think it's 1.2 million total, right, Jared, in subsidies that she got, that her family farm got. In 2018, she supported policies in a House Farm Bill that would cut food stamps. Again, government is here for us. It's supposed to serve folks, but it's unequal in how these payments are coming out from USDA. Back to you, Jared. I'm sorry.
Thanks for that, Don. So we've gotten some great questions coming in from the audience. So to start things off, I think this one's for you, Caroline. Aren't there limits on how much farmers can receive from these programs? So how are people getting millions of dollars?
That's a good question, and it is complicated. So traditional commodity subsidies do have a payment limit of $125,000 per year, but that $125,000 per year also applies to someone's spouse. So if you're with your spouse, you can get $250,000 per year. If you can prove that your family members also have some sort of stake in the farm, they too can get $125,000 per year. So it's easy to see how that can kind of be worked around to get even more money. And meanwhile, crop insurance does not have payment limits at all. So on average, the government subsidizes about 62% of farmers' crop insurance premiums, and that's regardless of how much they buy. So if a farmer were to buy, say, $3 million of crop insurance, it would be subsidized to the tune of $2 million.
All right, thanks for that. Another question that we had come in, essentially saying, do these members of Congress actually work on the farms that they get money from? Don, would you be able to tune in there?
Some do and some don't. I mean, I think for one of the more famous recipients is Senator Chuck Grassley from Iowa. You guys hearing that on my end?
Nope.
And he's notoriously is on his tractor farming his land. Others are not. A point I'd like to make also is that, a lot of these programs, like for food stamps in particular, you're kicked out of the program after a few months. You have a very meager benefit. You have a very small amount of money that you can make over the eligibility limit before you're kicked out of the program. None of these things apply to farm subsidies. One thing that does apply to farm subsidies is we found at EWG, and I think, Jared, you were part of this research, 22,000 farms in America have received federal subsidies every year for 32 years straight, including recent bailout payments. So there's a gross inequity in these programs. They're designed now to help wealthy landowners as opposed to hungry Americans who are struggling through a pandemic.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Another question that we had come in, how many members of Congress who get farm subsidies also grow the kinds of crops that are eligible for crop insurance subsidies? I'm happy to get in there. So we don't know. That's the problem, that that farm insurance isn't transparent. We don't know who gets what. And this is an area that needs to have some reform, because this is large amounts of money going to what could be affluent and successful farming operations that don't necessarily need the funds. And it's bypassing some of the smaller operations that could and need to be getting some more support through these programs. All right.
Exactly.
Yeah. Another question we had come in, shouldn't we be supporting our farmers during this time? And what's wrong with these folks receiving subsidies? I guess that's a question for anyone.
I can start off if you want.
Mm-hmm.
There's absolutely nothing wrong, at least from my perspective and from EWG's perspective, on farmers that are really having a hard time getting some government support. There's a role for government. It's to help people when they're struggling. The problem is a lot of these operations aren't struggling. They're highly capitalized. I think, as Caroline said earlier, as Jared said earlier, they are able to capitalize this money and hoover up all these little smaller farms who go out of business. It's literally a program that has helped consolidate the agriculture sector. So I always come back down to this. Is it a question of need? Do you need this money? If you don't, you should not get it.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, I don't have much of an issue of people taking subsidies if they're eligible for them. I'm a free market libertarian, but if I were eligible for subsidies, I might take them too. I don't personally fault people for that, but I think it does just show the larger issues in the system. I mean, I think we do need a government safety net for those farms that are truly struggling. And when the lion's share is going to these large programs, what we have is a system of corporate welfare and not a safety net. So I would argue that in order to actually return the farm safety net to its purpose and to make sure that funds are available to those truly in need, we need to get rid of these egregious cases.
I'd also add real quick, Jared, from an environmental perspective, we're always told that the Farm Bill programs, the conservation programs, they're there to protect wildlife habitat, they're there to protect water, ostensibly to protect climate. We're always told every Farm Bill cycle, there's not enough money for these programs, that we can't fund these programs well enough to help the environment. Yet we always seem to find money that goes to cousins living in Manhattan that might own a stake in a farm and call into a conference call once every 2 years, or 30, 40, 50,000, 60,000 acre size farms that are highly capitalized that don't need the money.
Mm-hmm. All right. So I think we have time for one more question that came in. Was who are some of the members who are on the agriculture committees who are taking in these subsidies? I'm happy to answer that. We've got 13 different members, and some of them are like Kelly Loeffler from Georgia, Doug Lamalfa, as we said earlier, Vicky Hartzler from Missouri, Mike Braun out of Indiana, who've all taken in very large amounts in subsidies and who are on the committees that are writing the rules to let them continue taking in these subsidies.
Yeah, I would add to that. I think I noticed 13 of the 33 that you identified were on House or Senate Ag, and of the top 5, so these are people that are getting $400,000 or more, in some cases up to $3.5 million. All of the top 5 are on House and Senate Ag, and that is not a coincidence.
No, it is not.
Yeah, I'd like to add that, Carolyn said something very smart earlier too, which is what part of government would we let this happen other than this part of government? Mm-hmm. It seems like, we wouldn't allow it. We wouldn't stand for folks being able to be on these committees and vote for their own, government paycheck. And it just seems to be okay for certain folks because we say the magic word farmer, I suppose.
Yeah. Yeah. Is Exxon allowed to write up their energy subsidies? Probably not.
Right.
All right. Well, thank you so much, you guys, for joining today. This was a great discussion. And again, if anyone wants to enter in comments in the comment section, we'll answer them after the chat. All right. Thanks so much, guys.